Welcome to Mind and Machine, where we explore the science and technology of human performance enhancement. I'm August Bradley. My guest today is Nir Eyal, who writes, consults, and teaches about the intersection of psychology, technology, and business. The MIT Technology Review dubbed Nir the prophet of habit-forming technology. Nir has taught at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Institute of Design at Stanford. He's the author of 2 best-selling books, Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. Indistractable received critical acclaim, winning the Outstanding Works of Literature Award, as well as being named one of the best business and leadership books of the year by Amazon, and one of the best personal development books of the year by Audible. Nir's writing has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, Time Magazine, and Psychology Today. We explore the psychology of focus and how to channel your mind to achieve more. If you're inspired by human and technological progress, consider subscribing to the free Mind and Machine newsletter at mindandmachine.io or at the links in the show notes. And it would be extremely helpful if you could help spread the word about the Mind and Machine podcast and YouTube show. The key to success and sustainability for us is word of mouth from listeners and viewers. I want to enhance our future by sharing essential insight on transformational changes and bringing more people into the conversation. And I want to make these technologies and this knowledge more widely available so we can all learn, grow, and achieve the things in life that matter most to each of us. Send anyone you think might be interested to mindandmachine.io. Subscribing to the podcast and or YouTube channel helps us build the show and our collective future. Now, let's dive in. Nir, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Your book, Indistractable, it goes deep into the psychology of personal effectiveness. And you point out that the power to do whatever you say you're going to do is the skill of the century. I'd add that particularly what you say to yourself that you're going to do. We hear so many endless tips and tricks and hacks all over the place in top 10 lists and Medium articles. How do you separate the signal from the noise? Like, how do you get to what actually makes a difference?
Absolutely. So this is a big reason why I wrote this book, was that I was trying to figure out why I couldn't do what I said I was going to do in my own life, right? I would say I was going to work out, but I didn't. I would say I was going to eat right, but I wouldn't. I would say I was going to work on that big project, and somehow I didn't every day. I'd have this massive to-do list of things, and I couldn't get through everything I said I would do day after day. And I found that this was kind of reinforcing this narrative that a lot of people had. This is part of why I kind of rail against to-do lists, because they basically reinforce to folks day after day, guess what? You still didn't do what you say you're going to do. You're still a liar. You're lying to yourself day in and day out. You can't finish what you said you were going to finish. And that doesn't feel good. And so I really wanted to understand, why do we get distracted? And it turns out that this is an age-old question that, in fact, 2,500 years before the iPhone, before Facebook, Plato asked this very question. He called it akrasia, the tendency that we all have to do things against our better interest. And so that was really where I started this journey to try and understand. I think it's such a fascinating question. If we know what to do, why don't we just do it, right? And today more than ever, if you don't know how to do something, anyone has access to Google. We can find the answer. What we don't know is how do we stop doing the things that take us off track? I think that's the real culprit these days.
I also want to highlight early here in the conversation that your book and your whole approach is not about blaming technology, and that it really starts with internal triggers. How do you frame that?
Yeah, absolutely. We see when it comes to this problem of distraction, people tend to fall into 2 categories. We have what's called the blamers and the shamers. The blamers, they say, oh, you see, it's Facebook doing it to me. It's my iPhone. It's Slack. It's that piece of chocolate cake. It's all this stuff outside of me that's the source of my problem. Those are the blamers. The shamers, they say, oh, you know what? Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not cut out for this job. I have a short attention span. There must be something wrong with me. Those are the shamers. And of course, that backfires because that makes the problem even worse, because the worse we feel about ourselves, the more shame we experience, the more likely we are to seek escape from these internal triggers, from these uncomfortable emotional states with, guess what? Even more distraction. So we don't want to be blamers. We don't want to be shamers. We want to be what we call claimers. Claimers claim responsibility for their actions. They acknowledge that, look, this stuff isn't your fault. You didn't invent email. You didn't invent the chocolate cake. You didn't invent the iPhone. These things aren't your fault, but they are our responsibility, because we can't control how we feel per se. What we can control is our reaction to these feelings. So a big part of it becoming indistractable, and this is something that I was really frustrated that I didn't see in any other books on this topic of distraction or productivity or time management or focus, is the acknowledgement that, look, it's not about the tips and tricks and life hacks. It's fundamentally, none of that stuff will work unless we understand why we get distracted in the first place. And it turns out the root cause of distraction, it's not the external triggers. It's not the pings and dings and things in our environment that tend to distract us, but more so it is what's going on inside of us. It's our inability to cope with these uncomfortable states in a healthier manner. So when we're feeling lonely, we impulsively check Facebook. When we're uncertain, we Google. When we're bored, we check sports scores, we check the news, we check Reddit, we check Pinterest. All of these things cater to these uncomfortable internal triggers. So the very first step has to be to master these internal triggers, because fundamentally, time management is pain management. And if we don't learn how to manage these uncomfortable internal triggers, we will always succumb to distraction from one thing or another. I mean, look at the proof's in the pudding. How many of us have read these productivity books? How many of us know how to get things done, or whatever the technique du jour is, and yet we don't follow through? It's because we're not focusing on the right thing.
Your book it reads to me more like a psychology book than the traditional book in that category. And you talk about how all, the avoidance of discomfort drives a lot of these distractions and behaviors. Can you go a little deeper into that and how time management is pain management?
Sure, absolutely. So let's start with first what we mean by distraction. I think it's an important thing to get clarity around. Most people, when you ask them what distraction is all about, and you say, okay, well, the best way to understand what it is to understand what it is not, and you ask them what's the opposite of distraction, most people will tell you the opposite of distraction is focus. But I actually disagree. I think the opposite of distraction is not focus, but rather the opposite of distraction, if you look at the etymology of the word, is traction. That both traction and distraction come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. And you'll notice both words end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action. So traction is defined as any action that pulls you towards what you want to do, things that you do with intent. Now, the opposite of traction is distraction, anything that pulls you away from what you plan to do with intent. Now, why is this so important? Because I'd argue that anything can become a distraction, right? How many of us, this happened to me every single day, see if this resonates with you. I would sit down at my desk and I'd say, okay, now I'm going to work on that big project. Now I'm going to do the thing that I've been procrastinating on. Here I go. I'm going to get to work. But let me check email first. Right? Let me just scroll that Slack channel. Let me just do that one thing that I need to do. And of course, that is distraction tricking us. We think that that's a productive task. We think that that's something that we need to do, but that's pseudo work. And what we do when we do those kind of tasks, we become distracted because we prioritize the urgent at the expense of the important. And I argue that that is even a worse distraction than playing Candy Crush or checking Facebook, because at least when you do those things, it's pretty clear that you're slacking off. But when you keep doing these reactive tasks like email or Slack channels, or just let me Google this one thing, we think it's worky, but it's actually keeping us from what we really want to do. So anything can become a distraction. Conversely, anything can be traction. So look, there's nothing wrong with checking Facebook or watching a YouTube video. There's nothing morally superior to playing Candy Crush versus watching a football game, as long as you plan time for it, as long as it's something that you do based on your values and according to your schedule, not someone else's. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So anything can be traction, anything can be distraction. Now, to get to your question, once we understand this dichotomy, what pulls us towards either traction or distraction? So we have two things. We have what's called the external triggers, and those are the pings, the dings, the rings, these things in our environment. Then what we also have are the internal triggers, and the internal triggers tend to be the root cause of the problem. The internal triggers are these uncomfortable emotional states that we seek to escape from. Boredom, uncertainty, fatigue, loneliness, whatever it might be. These are things that we are looking to escape from with some kind of distraction, to take our mind off of these uncomfortable emotional states. Now, in order to understand how this works, we have to understand the root cause of all motivation. that, it's not just about why do we get distracted, but why do we do everything and anything? And it turns out to answer that question, we have to go a little bit deeper. That most people will tell you that the nature of human motivation is about pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. This is called Freud's pleasure principle. And we've all heard some version of carrots and sticks, right? Unfortunately, neurologically speaking, it's not true. That in fact, everything we do is not about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, but rather everything we do for one reason. And that is the desire to escape discomfort. Everything we do. And so whether it's, if you think about this physiologically, if you think about how if you go outside and it's too cold, that's uncomfortable, so you put on a jacket. If you walk back inside, now it's too hot, you take it off. If you eat too much, you feel stuffed, so you stop eating. All of these things are uncomfortable physiological states that get us to do something. And the same holds true for our psychological states, right? So when we are lonely, we check Facebook. When we're uncertain, we Google. When we're bored, we check, God knows what website, all kinds of things. We have to come to grips with that everything we do is about the desire to escape discomfort. And this is why time management is pain management.
Is the pain disguised? Because it doesn't feel like pain or even discomfort. It just seems so harmless to take a minute to check the latest news headline or just see this blog or this blog post that it seems actually relevant to the business I'm doing and therefore somewhat productive. And then it's how I get thrown off. And then 40 minutes later, there I am.
Exactly.
But it doesn't seem like pain avoidance. It seems like the shiny thing. How do we dig deeper and understand that more fully?
Yeah, so this is distraction doing an amazing job of tricking us, right? Yeah. And I would argue there's nothing wrong with any of those things you want to do with your time. There's nothing wrong with checking the news. There's nothing wrong with anything that might potentially distract you. It's about when we do them and why we do them. If you are doing them to pacify an uncomfortable emotional state, if you sit down at your desk and you say, I don't really want to do that really hard project I have to work on right now. That's tough, right? That's difficult. Let me just check email real quick. Let me just check this news website because that feels worky. That's where we tend to be tricked by distraction. And that's really what takes us off track.
We hear so much about having to control these external triggers, internal triggers and external triggers. So much of the focus is on the external triggers. But so much of the value in your book is that it emphasizes the internal triggers, and that's step one is where you start.
Right.
And it's easy to blame the notifications and the endless barrage of email. As you lay it out, it wasn't something I thought a lot about, but it resonates so much that it's the voice inside my head that's driving so much of this. And I think it's very easy to follow the traditional narrative of this being
and let's
stop the distractions.
Absolutely. And let's be clear, there is definitely a lot you can do about the external triggers. I just don't think that's the first step. I think many people, they're confused by why is it that after I've removed all these external triggers. So this is what happened in my life. I read all of these books on the topic and I did what they told me to do, right? Do the 30-day digital detox, throw away your technology, stop using social media. I actually did this because I wanted to see, well, maybe these books have the answer to my problem. So I got a flip phone that had no apps, no internet connection. I got a word processor from the 1990s. They don't even make these anymore. And I found one that has no internet connection so I can just do my writing. And then I would sit down on my desk and I would say, you know what, there's that book on my bookshelf that I need to do some more research in. Or let me just tidy up my desk real quick. Or you know what, the trash needs to be taken out. Let me just throw out the trash real quick. And I kept getting distracted because I hadn't done step one, which is to understand why I was getting distracted. That has to be the first step. And so when you do what I call master these internal triggers, now you have a toolkit. Now you know how to respond to this discomfort in a healthier manner that leads you towards traction rather than distraction. So that has to be the first step.
And you were telling me before we started recording that you'd spent 5 years researching this book. This wasn't some summary of best practices.
Yeah.
This was 5 years of a lot of personal trial and error and experimentation.
Right. So the book really had to meet two criteria for me, which is one, to solve my own problem of distraction. I was patient zero here, but also it couldn't just be some, this worked for me, so it's going to work for everybody. Everything in the book needed to be backed by some peer-reviewed study. I mean, there's 20 pages of citations. There's everything in there is backed by published research. And so it's a lot of it is decades old, but I think nobody had filtered out a lot of the folk psychology out there that is really ineffective. And I overturned a lot of things that I believed were true. For example, how, to-do lists are the answer to everything, or this idea of willpower. It turns out there's a lot of research these days around how willpower, at minimum, doesn't work the way we thought it worked, and may not even work at all.
Yeah, I found that it was really important. So short term. Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so, the book is really for people who don't have good willpower, who don't have self-control, like me. I mean, even the word self-discipline kind of sends shivers down my spine, because I used to be clinically obese. And the message I would constantly get from people is, well, just show some more willpower, show some more self-discipline. And it doesn't work. Self-discipline, self-control doesn't work in the moment. What works is a system, is a practice, is an identity for how to be indistractable.
Yeah, I would argue that willpower beyond a very short time doesn't work for anybody except maybe David Goggins. But generally speaking, well, and even it's an identity he's formed. I think
exactly.
That's
it's an identity, it's
key.
a system, it's a practice. Yeah.
Right. It's absolutely not about it, and systems help you form that identity, right? It's you can establish a practice that perhaps initially starts with some willpower, but ultimately you want to have guardrails and rules to how you're approaching things. And the idea is ultimately to build an identity around that.
Right, absolutely. And so, if there's one mantra that sums up the book, it's that the antidote to impulsiveness is forethought. And I think that's something that even David Goggins could definitely agree with. And I'm a fan of his, by the way. If you look at his life, it's not impulsive. It's not, I want to go run right now, right? That's not how that's not how he lives his life. He is very intentional. So distraction is a problem of impulsiveness. But the antidote to impulsiveness is forethought. Our species has this amazing evolutionary gift that we can see the future with greater fidelity than any other animal on the face of the earth. And so if you don't plan ahead, they're going to get you, right? If the chocolate cake is on the fork on its way to your mouth, you're going to eat it. If the cigarette is lit in your hand, you're going to smoke it. If the cell phone is on your nightstand every morning when you wake up first thing in the morning, you're going to pick it up before you even say hello to your loved one, because it's too late. You've already lost. But where we have power is when we use forethought, when we plan ahead. That's what this is all about.
So you establish the path ahead of time so that
that's right.
You're then following what you've designed. You're not just winging it.
That's right. And then you don't need any willpower. You don't need any self-control, right? You've used this system in place that makes it very, very easy to do. Exactly. Exactly.
So in terms of fighting these internal or establishing and guiding your internal triggers in a direction that supports where you want to go, because all of this is in support not of some arbitrary goal or some edict from above, but this is all to pursue the things you've defined for yourself as important, whatever they are.
Right.
And so to establish these internal triggers, you've talked about how you need to either fix the source of the discomfort or cope with the discomfort that we can't remove and change how we react to the discomfort. Is one better than the other? Or how do you work with these two? Or where do you start?
Yeah, so clearly we definitely want to fix the sources of the discomfort that we can fix. So there's actually a whole section in the book that's about how do we create an indistractable workplace. And I think the revelation for me was that distraction in the workplace is not actually caused by technology. It's perpetuated by technology. The root cause of the problem is a dysfunctional workplace culture. And so, what I studied, looking at the research around, what type of work environment is known to literally drive people crazy, and I don't use that word figuratively. I'm saying literally. We know that there's a work environment that is more likely to lead to depression and anxiety disorder, and that type of work environment is a work environment where there's the confluence of two factors: high expectations coupled with low control. This is the work of Stansfield and Candy. And they've shown that when a work environment has those two conditions, this is the kind of environment that leads to more depression, anxiety disorder. And of course, those are internal triggers, right? When people feel excessive amounts of anxiety, depressive disorder, they feel bad. And so what do they do to feel better? Well, they send more superfluous emails. They call more meetings that didn't need to be called. Not only do they distract themselves, they distract everyone else in the office because of this desperate need for more control, more agency. I mean, we do these things because we are lacking somehow in this psychological need for agency. And so that's not a problem that's caused by the technology. I say that distraction at work is a symptom of cultural dysfunction. And so that's the kind of problem that needs to be solved systemically. Now, most of the book, about half the book, is about the stuff you can do for yourself, right? How you can become indistractable. But of course, we do operate in various contexts. So there's a whole section in the book about how to build an indistractable workplace, how to raise indistractable kids, and how to have indistractable relationships. And so the second half of the book is about things that operate outside of you, our various environments, and how we can become indistractable in those various environments as well.
So how to apply it broadly. First, you have to master it for yourself, and then you bring it to the world around you.
That's right. That's right. And there's so much we can do right now, right? I mean, there's no reason that we should wait just because the technology we find is distracting or because our workplace culture demands it. There's so much we can do right now. And that, of course, is the best place to affect change as well. When you become indistractable, that kind of radiates to other people as well.
One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting was the effectiveness of the 10-minute rule that you described, because you have this sense when you are craving something that this is just a fixed state that you're perpetually in until you satisfy it. But the 10-minute rule suggests otherwise, that these are passing cravings.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the 10-minute rule is a practice that I use all the time. It's not something I invented. It comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. It's been around for decades. The idea here is that when we feel these uncomfortable emotional states, psychologists tell us the first thing we should do is to simply note the sensation. If we can write down, and I give everyone in the book what's called the distraction tracker, but you can do this with a piece of paper as well, simply writing down what that sensation is. Boredom, uncertainty, fatigue, loneliness, fear. What is that sensation? If you can interrupt that internal trigger so that you don't impulsively reach for that thing to take your mind off of that discomfort, that's a wonderful first step.
And that's basically the mindfulness, right? That's essentially the foundation of meditation.
It's part of it, right? I don't explicitly go into meditation per se, not because it doesn't work, but because I just think it's been written about ad nauseum. There are other books that talk about meditation, so I wanted people to have other techniques as well.
Right.
But this practice of saying, wait a minute, is this really what I want to do right now? What was I looking to escape from is a part of mindfulness.
Right.
Certainly.
The idea of becoming present and just observing the immediate sensations so that they're not just dragging you around blindly, but you're aware of them and you're just becoming very conscious of them so that you can make a decision based on that knowledge and awareness. Seems like a very practical first step. Go ahead, continue.
Right. Yeah. So when you find yourself distracted, you're stopping, you're saying, okay, I'm noting the sensation. What was it that I was looking to escape from? What was that internal trigger? I write that down. And then what I want to do is to use this 10-minute rule, where the 10-minute rule says that I can give in to any distraction, whether it's that piece of chocolate cake you don't really need, or whether it's checking email when you need to work on that big project, whatever the case might be. Giving yourself just 10 minutes to say, I can give in to that distraction. I can do that thing, that temptation, in just 10 minutes. Now, for those 10 minutes, you can only do one of two things. You can either get back to the task at hand, get back to the thing you really wanted to do with your time, or do what's called surf the urge. Now, surfing the urge is about just feeling that sensation with curiosity rather than contempt, exploring what is that sensation inside of you and just sitting with that sensation. Many times I'll just take my phone, I'll say, set the timer for 10 minutes, I'll put the phone down, and my job is to just sit and contemplate with curiosity rather than contempt about what it is I'm feeling. And you will notice that by the time those 10 minutes are up, and when you're allowed to give into that distraction at the end of 10 minutes, 9 times out of 10, that desire will have crested and subsided. This is how emotions work. They're like waves. And so our job is to do what's called surf the urge. We can ride that sensation like a surfer on a surfboard. And the reason this is so powerful, many people say, well, why not just abstain, right? Why not just tell yourself, don't do it? And it turns out that strict abstinence can backfire. And it backfires in particular with things we can't necessarily escape. Let me give you a great example. Right now, I want you to do something that you have not, I want you to not do something that you have not done all day long. So it's not going to be very hard to do, right? Right now, I want you with all your might to resist thinking about a white bear. Don't do it. Whatever you do, don't think about a white bear.
Well, of course. Stating it
you can't
conjures the
exactly you
image.
can't think of
Right.
anything but a white bear, right?
Right.
And so this is why it's so hard to have strict abstinence, because when we tell ourselves not to do something, we tend to ruminate on it. We tell ourselves, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And when we finally give into it, we are reinforcing the very thing we're trying not to do. And so that relief of the discomfort of telling ourselves not to do something is registered in the brain as pleasure. And this is why strict abstinence backfires. So we need other coping techniques that are much more effective.
So with this in terms of actually implementing this technique, after 10 minutes, if you still wanted to do it, would you let yourself do it in order to keep that contract with yourself to make it a legitimate technique for the future? Is that an important part of it, or? Okay.
Absolutely. Like if surf the urge for 10 minutes and you still find that you have that urge, go for it. But what you're doing is reinforcing. This is one of the most important aspects of the book. Self-identity is incredibly important, right? If you just lie to yourself and are okay with that, you're reinforcing your identity as being disingenuous, right? The definition of being indistractable is striving to do what you say you're going to do. Right? It's about living with personal integrity. It's about being honest, as honest with yourself as you are with other people. And so that's absolutely part of the practice as well. Now, the second step after we master these internal triggers is to make time for traction. And this is where I talk about the importance of time boxing. So the nice part about using these 4 steps in tandem, right? The fact that we're using all of them together, these 4 steps, is that even if you allow yourself to give into that temptation, because of step 2, which involves time boxing, you're actually you're guarded in terms of how long you can go off track for, because part of time boxing is planning out how you want to spend every minute of your day, and so you can only go so far off track before the next time block arises, and so you can pick yourself up and get back on track.
Yeah, I've found that to be massively helpful in my own life and workflow, and even when I work with clients on presumably more complex consulting engagements, like I'll start with this, and this will have a radical transformation just from day one. It's so simple. I mean, by time boxing, you just mean scheduling on a calendar, right? It's literally just sectioning out the day before or the Sunday before what your intention for that day, and you might be just derailed from it, and then you schedule out the rest of the day. Is that
Right.
how you approach it?
So this is what we do instead of using a to-do list. So I'm not a fan of to-do lists. I think that there's this belief out there in the productivity community that if we just put things on a to-do list, they'll magically get done. That there's some kind of productivity fairy that shows up and does all the things on our to-do list for us. And of course, that fairy never showed up for me. If you know his or her number, let me know, because I've never met the productivity fairy. And so instead of having these days where day after day we recycle half of our to-do list day after day after day, studies find that by setting what's called an implementation intention, and I'm talking thousands of studies have shown this by now, by simply keeping a calendar of how we want to spend our time, and I mean for our entire day, not just based on work, right? 2/3 of Americans don't keep any sort of a calendar. Even the 1/3 who do keep a calendar, it's only about work-related tasks. And what I guide people to do is to ask ourselves, how can I turn my values into time? So, of course, work is part of that. There's the work domain. That's where most people start. But I actually think we should start with ourselves. So if one of your values is to take care of your physical health, well, do you have time in your day to exercise? Do you have time scheduled for proper rest? You got to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. Then we've got time with our important relationships, our friends, our family, our loved ones. Is that time built into our day as well? And then finally, our work schedules. And when it comes to our work, it's not just about being a busy bee all day, right? It's not just about meeting after meeting after meeting. It's also about, look, if your job requires focus, if it requires contemplation, if it requires concentration, is that time in your day? Because if it's not in your day, the fact is it won't happen. Yep. And so not only do we have to have a template for our entire week, and the reason we do that, by the way, for a very important reason, that we have no right to say we got distracted if we don't know what we got distracted from.
Yeah,
so fair. The purpose of making a time box calendar is that we can point to it for any minute of the day and say, that's what I wanted to do. Anything that is not that is a distraction. So anything on my calendar is traction. Anything not on my calendar is distraction, including the fun stuff, right? I want you to put on your calendar, enjoy that big game on TV, watch a movie on Netflix, go on Facebook, Instagram, whatever you enjoy, but plan for it. Have that time on your schedule. And then the final thing is that we want to do what's called a schedule sync. And I think even for people who know time boxing, this is a real game changer. We know that if we can synchronize our schedule with the stakeholders in our life, that really is a game changer. So if we can sit down with our loved one, for example, your domestic partner, your husband, your wife, your significant other, sit down with them and show them this calendar. Sit down with your boss. It takes literally 15 minutes a week. And if you can show your boss your calendar and say, look, boss, here's my week ahead. Here's how I plan to spend my time. Now there's this list of other things that you asked me to do that I don't know how to fit into that schedule. I don't see time for it. Can you help me reprioritize? And this solves this age-old problem that you've heard this advice trope 100 million times. You've always heard, if you want more focus, you need to say no, right? You just need to learn to say no. That's really hard to tell your boss no. So
right, when you don't control your schedule.
Boss,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So don't tell your boss no. Get your boss to tell you no by showing them the calendar and saying, help me reprioritize. Believe me, your boss will worship the ground you walk on if you give them this opportunity. And of course, you have the upper hand here. This is how we manage up. This is how we manage our managers. So it's about keeping that time box calendar and then doing this weekly schedule sync.
Yeah, a good boss is going to respect the discipline you're bringing to being an effective person. And to me, the value of this, and like this resonates so much with me. This is how I live my life ever since I discovered this. And I learned a lot more techniques in your book on how to implement it better. But it highlights in any given moment, any choice you're making, what the cost is. Because typically you don't know what the cost is. It seems free. It's especially if it's early in the day and you got plenty of time to get back to work. But if it's on your schedule, and you're talking about scheduling, time with your kids or your spouse or your friends, workout time, meditation time, anything that matters to you in addition to work, and have it the entire day, minute to minute, booked out. So at any given point, if something comes up, and sometimes urgent things do come up, but what you're trading off for that and what the cost of not getting done is being traded for doing that thing.
Absolutely.
Do you during the day reschedule your day if something big enough does come up?
So there's only 3 causes of distraction. If you don't implement that daily plan that you've have on your time box calendar, it's only because of an external trigger, an internal trigger, or a planning problem. There's only 3 reasons for any potential distraction. And so what you do is, if something does distract you, you are running each week as an experiment. When you make a time box calendar, you're not saying, oh, this is going to be the calendar that I'm going to follow for the rest of my life, no matter what happens. No, every week is an experiment. You're running this experiment week after week. And by the way, it only takes you 15 minutes to do this quick review for the week ahead. And you're asking yourself, how can this calendar be made easier to follow? Right? So if I found, there was this external trigger, my boss tapped me on the shoulder last week, and that's why I got distracted. What can I do about it next week so that doesn't happen again? And so I give you techniques like I give everyone a screen sign, for example, that they can put on their computer monitor to tell colleagues that they're busy. It turns out that's the number one source of distraction. 80% of external triggers come from other people, not necessarily the pings and dings on your phone. And so we can ask ourselves, how can we make it easier to follow the week ahead? If it's an internal trigger, what's this internal trigger that I don't know currently how to face? How can I use other tools to help me deal with that internal trigger? If it's a planning problem, I thought I needed an hour and a half to do my email, but it turned out I need an hour 45 or 2 hours, whatever the case might be. And I'm adjusting that in the week ahead. But once I make that schedule, it has to be something really, a real emergency to take me off that schedule. And sometimes that happens too. But the idea is that we want to do as much as we can to stick to that schedule as much as possible.
Yeah, I love the idea of putting up the sign and sort of just telling people ahead of time, I'm going to set up my day so I have these intense periods of focus because I just need that to make things happen. And people totally understand when you tell them that. I don't know if the sign just popped up without an explanation, how people would react in a cubicle open workspace, but I think you can set that up properly. And to me, what you're talking about, getting rid of the to-do list, was so powerful because the to-do list is like this wish list, and it's just this burden. It's this weight, and you just throw things on there, and it's so long, and it's impossibly long, and it's just this weight on your shoulders. So I got rid of the to-do list. I have a to-schedule list, which is just a quick add. It's almost like an inbox to sort out when I have a moment. But even the to schedule list is assigned to a day. Like I'll schedule a day. To schedule just means either the day before or the Sunday before, I'll schedule hour by hour for the upcoming day, usually tomorrow. But the to schedule list is assigned to a day, so it's partially scheduled already. And if I need to bump it, I bump it. But the to schedule list lets me just do the quick ads. But by labeling that, I know that's not the to-do list. I have an obligation to schedule that before it's actually on my active list.
And what you're doing when you do this kind of practice is that when you get to the end of the day, and most people haven't ever experienced it, and it is a euphoric feeling. When I discovered this methodology and I started implementing it in my life, you get to the end of your day and you feel amazing. Like you can spend time with your kids. You can go to the gym. You can watch Netflix without guilt. I mean, day after day, because when I used to just keep a big old to-do list, I would feel guilty every day. Another day that I'm a loser and I didn't do what I said I'm going to do. Now, every day, I just need to follow my plan. I've got my Timebox calendar. I know what I'm going to do. And I measure myself based on one criteria. Not did I finish a task? No. My only criteria is, did I work without distraction for that period of time? That's my only criteria. And as long as I do that, I won. Because this is the part of the problem. You know, so many of us, this wish list, not only do we keep this wish list without actually planning the time, we're also really bad at predicting how long a task will take us to complete. We write, finish the report, finish the project, finish this, finish that. You know, studies have found that people are horrible at predicting how long something will take. And so what I tell people is don't plan to finish anything. Just put in the input. If you consistently work on that input without distraction, you will get it done. Of course, most people, because the task is so big, so onerous, they keep procrastinating and they don't even start on that task, right? They don't even start making progress. Whereas, of course, if you consistently work without distraction, time box after time box after time box, you, of course, will finish that task much quicker than if you didn't plan the time.
The risk of scheduling the outcome rather than the activity, the task, is that you feel day after day like you're failing. Like if you didn't finish the output, you failed. And if you do that persistently, that gets to be draining. But if success is sitting down for the amount of time you've scheduled and working on it, then you're consistently succeeding. You know, and
that's exactly right.
That's empowering. That's quite the opposite. A lot of the resonance I heard in the book reminded me of what I hear from Jocko Willink. Are you familiar with him?
Yes, absolutely. Big fan.
His whole thing is, you know, it sounds like the schedule is going to be constricting. It's going to confine you. Like this level of discipline and scheduling is putting you in a box, but it's quite the opposite because it frees you. Because what's more constricting than being at the end of the day and worried about not getting stuff done, and you don't get the free time you hoped you would have because you're always playing catch up and always trying to dig yourself out of that endless to-do list. But when you schedule it out and you schedule the free time, when you have free time or it's assigned in some capacity, when you have personal time, then it's truly free and you're truly released of the burden and the worry of everything else.
That's right. And it doesn't mean you can't have fun. It's quite the opposite. I want you to schedule time for fun, right? So for example, in my weekends, I have a 3-hour block to be with my wife and my daughter. Now we call this planned spontaneity, right? Because I plan that 3-hour block, but we're going to be spontaneous about what we do. Now, why do we do that? Because I know what I will not be doing. I will not be checking work email. I will not be on social media. I will not be distracted. I will be with them because that is their time. I have planned for that time in advance. So I want you to plan the fun stuff too. This isn't just about, working all day long, but it's about making sure that you can turn your values into time. Your calendar should be a reflection of your values.
Yeah, and then those personal family time becomes truly personal family time instead of time you're worrying or trying to juggle. Okay, so because
it's not just going to slip in. It's not just going to happen spontaneously. You're not going to finish that novel or that big project or form a relationship with your friends spontaneously. You know what we're going to do? We're going to putz around on Facebook. We're going to check Instagram. We're going to do all this other stuff that's not really what we want to do with our time.
Yeah, you never feel good afterward. So there are sort of 4 steps that we've talked about: mastering internal triggers and making time for traction, which is where you recommend starting. Then you get to number 3 is hacking back external triggers. What are sort of best-in-class techniques in your experience for that?
Right. So we've got these external triggers, the pings, dings, and rings and things in our life that can lead us towards traction or distraction. And so what we want to do is to ask ourselves in all the different domains in our life, are these external triggers serving me or am I serving them? So whether it's your email, which I show you how to reduce the time you spend on email by up to 90%, whether it's group chat, whether it's on your desktop, whether it's meetings. Oh my goodness, what a huge waste of time meetings can be. So I show you in all these different domains how you can hack back these external triggers. one of the most prevalent sources of distractions we talked about earlier is the open floor plan office, right? It's your colleague coming in and tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, can I talk to you for a quick sec? It's never a quick sec, right? It's always a distraction. And so the idea is, how do we hack back those external triggers? So I show you systematically in these 8 different environments how you can hack back these external triggers to make sure that they are serving you as opposed to you serving them.
Okay. And then the fourth one I was particularly intrigued with was prevent distraction with pacts, which are internal commitments. And this could be a whole episode itself, but what's sort of the overview of this?
Absolutely. So this technique is the fail-safe. So this is the last backstop to prevent distraction, and it's something that actually can backfire. So do not do what I'm about to describe first. You have to do it after you've mastered the internal triggers, after you've made time for traction, after you've hacked back the external triggers. Then we can use this last technique of preventing distraction with pacts. And the way that this technique works, it's all about making a pre-commitment. It's all about making a promise to yourself or to someone else in a way that makes you much more likely to do what you say you're going to do. So there are 3 types of pre-commitments. We have an effort pact. An effort pact is when we put some bit of friction in between us and something we don't want to do. Then we have what's called a price pact, where there's some kind of economic disincentive to getting distracted. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is what we call an identity pact. An identity pact is when we have some kind of moniker, some kind of self-image that keeps us on track, that makes us much less likely to get distracted. And so this actually comes from the research around the psychology of religion, that we know that when someone calls themselves a devout Christian or an observant Muslim or even a vegetarian, they become much more likely to do what they say they're going to do. So a vegetarian, doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I wonder if I should have some bacon today. No, a vegetarian is who they are. It is their identity, and it makes them much more likely to stay on track. And so this is why the book is titled Indistractable, because I want this to be a new moniker. I want this to be a new identity for people. And the good news is we've acted before. I remember when I grew up in the early 1980s, I remember people would come to our home and there would be ashtrays in our living room. Why do we have ashtrays in our living room? My parents did not smoke at the time. Why did we have ashtrays? Because back in the early 80s, this is going to sound ridiculous to people who don't remember this time, but back then, people would just walk into your house and just assume they could light a cigarette in your living room. That is just what people did. One day, my mom took away the ashtrays, and she told one of her friends that came over and took out a pack of cigarettes and was about to light her cigarette in our living room. She said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're non-smokers. If you want to smoke, please go outside." She was so offended, right? This was such a rude thing to ask someone to do. Of course, today it would be incredibly rude if someone smoked a pack of cigarettes in your living room. Can't even imagine such a thing. Yeah. But of course, at the time, it was rude to ask them to leave and go outside to smoke.
That's
and
incredible.
So why did that change? Why was that societal shift? Why did that happen? Was it regulation? I don't think so. There's never been a law that says you can't smoke in someone's living room. What changed is our norms, our manners, what we believed was acceptable or not acceptable around these practices. And so that's what I'm looking for when it comes to starting this movement around people who call themselves indistractable. That just by listening to this episode, you've learned some techniques now that you can proudly proclaim. You don't have to do everything I advise in the book. You can start proclaiming to yourself and to other people, I'm indistractable. I'm the kind of person who decides how I spend my time, how I spend my attention, and how I spend my life. I don't let that be controlled by other people. I strive to do what I say I'm going to do. And frankly, yeah, I do some weird things. You know what? I don't answer every text message in 30 seconds. I schedule out my day. I put this screen sign on my monitor. Is that any different or more unusual than someone who maybe eats a diet that's not conventional or maybe wears religious garb that's a bit unusual? I don't think so. It's part of this new movement of people who say, I am indistractable. This is part of who I am.
Yeah, so ultimately, the goal of all this is to have indistractability as part of your identity. That's right. Like you said, how you define yourself. It just seems to me, like we touched on earlier, anything that's going to be long-term, and by long-term I mean years, then it has to become part of your identity. If it doesn't, Absolutely. Then it doesn't last. But it just becomes who you are, which you see clearly with vegetarians and vegans, fitness people. I'm a fit person. I don't eat junk food, and I work out every day. That's what I do. It's not a debate. It's not a willpower. It's not you don't play games with yourself. It's just what you do, which may be hard at the beginning when it's not your identity. But I find that if you get into these feedback loops, you try something, you get a positive result, you do which inspires you to do it again. You get a positive result, and you do enough of these feedback loops that leads to the identity. So you sort of need to initiate the feedback loop that's going to get the positive result. And of course, you need to stick with it long enough to see the positive result. But it seems the whole game is getting to that identity level.
That's right. That's right. And the good news is you don't have to do everything to call yourself this, right? You don't have to be perfect in every way. We all will fall off track from time to time. That's not what becoming indistractable is. Becoming indistractable doesn't mean you never get distracted. The definition of becoming indistractable means you're the kind of person who strives to do what they say they're going to do. You strive to live with personal integrity. And so we can all start calling ourselves indistractable right now. And that method of just having this identity and knowing that this is important to you, this guides your decision making, is a very important step to ultimately accomplishing what you want to do in life.
Along these lines, you had made a comment that being indistractable doesn't mean you don't get distracted, but it means you don't get distracted by the same thing over and over again. So when you do get distracted, you quickly learn from it, and then you set up the systems to avoid that distraction going forward. That was a really good insight.
So there's a great quote by Paulo Coelho, who said that a mistake repeated more than once is a decision. Right. So how many of us, I mean, myself included, right, I would keep getting distracted by the same stuff day after day, week after week, and I wouldn't do anything about it. I mean, at that point, it becomes a decision. Now you've reinforced an identity that you're incapable of doing what you say you're going to do. And so that really does backfire. And I think you're absolutely right that long-term behavior change is identity change. It's a critical component.
And if you betray the commitment you make to yourself over and over, then you're just never going to take your own commitment seriously. I mean, it's almost like antibiotics. If you don't take them the full amount, immunity is built up against them. Right. So you sort of undermine your ability to ever make the decision if you don't commit to it. So this highlights the importance. So I think we've really hammered the importance of what I think is the most important one, the identity pact. Just quickly, what's the effort pact and the price pact? How do those work?
Sure. So effort pact is when you put a bit of friction in between something that you don't want to do. So for example, in my household, we found that every night my wife and I were going to bed later and later at night. And so we wanted to get to bed on time so that we could get proper rest. And so we decided to go to the hardware store, and I bought us an outlet timer. And this outlet timer, whatever you plug into it, will turn on and or off at a certain time of day or night. So we set our outlet timer to 10 p.m. and every night at 10 p.m., our internet router shuts off. Right. So it's a bit of effort. Now, if I wanted to turn it back on, of course I could. I could go and fidget with this thing and unplug it and replug in my router. I could do that, but that's effortful. That takes some work to do. And so I'm much less likely to do it. So that would be an example of an effort pact. And of course, there's many others in the book.
You just build up obstacles to the things that you know you're going to be tempted to do.
Right. And again, this is the last resort. So first, if you have a very strong internal trigger that you don't know how to deal with, then you will actually unplug and replug. You will find a different way to get online. So that's why this is the last resort. You first have to do those other 3 steps. So that's the effort pact. The price pact is when we have some kind of monetary disincentive to not doing what we want to do. So for example, if it's with my book, for example, I spent 4 years researching it, and it was finally time to write the darn thing. And so I'd read this research around how effective price pacts can be. It's in fact the most successful smoking cessation study in history used a similar technique. And so I made a bet with my friend Mark, who's a fellow author, and I told him, look, if I don't finish my manuscript by January 1st, I will give you $10,000. Right. And of course, you think I gave him the $10,000? Of course I didn't. I finished my manuscript because I had this financial disincentive to getting distracted. If I didn't stay on track, then I would have to give up my money. But of course, I kept my money and I got my manuscript. And so it can be a very effective technique. Again, only if it's used last.
Okay. And you have talked about your morning routine, and what resonated with me and I thought was most powerful about it, because I have a similar approach, is that your morning routine starts with the evening routine the night before. How do you set up the next day the night before? What's your process there?
Yeah, so I actually do it once a week. You can do it once a day if your day, if you find that your day tends to change daily. If you don't know what meetings you might have in the next day, my schedule, and most people that I interviewed, they pretty much know what the week ahead looks like. And so I actually have time in my schedule every Sunday evening where I sit down and I look at the week ahead and I ask myself, how can my schedule be made easier to help me do what I say I'm going to do? And so that's when I'll review the days of the week and make adjustments and make more time or less time for different things based on that week ahead.
Okay, and then when you prioritize the morning as the where you put the most important things in your day. In your case, you've talked about writing being a high priority and exercise. So you'll actually attack those things right off the bat before noon, and then you'll do secondary priorities after that.
Yeah. So what we want to do is we want to start with these 3 life domains. So first you start with the domain of you. How do you take care of your own needs, whether that's exercise, proper nutrition, proper rest? First you start with you. You put in those tasks first. Then the life domain of your relationship. So make sure you have time for the important people in your life. And then the work domain. And so this can be a much more effective technique than I think what I see a lot of people do. You know, people make vision boards and 5-year plans and the regrets of the dying and all these, lofty goals. And my response is, how about next week? Can we just start with next week? Like, let's figure out how we can do what we say we're going to do. How can we help you live your values for just next week? And so for me, I like doing, exercise first thing in the morning and writing first thing in the morning. But if that doesn't suit you, the idea is that you're experimenting. You're a scientist in a laboratory, and so you're playing around with how you can make the most ideal schedule. The idea is to not ask yourself. A lot of folks, when they see these time box calendars, they have this initial reaction of, "Oh, that's too rigid. I can't do that because my boss is in another country, and we have a distributed team, and we're in the client services business." And they look for every reason why it can't work. I've heard every excuse in the book. What we need to do, part of the methodology, is to figure out, how can I make this work, right? How can I make it conform to my lifestyle and my goals? And I haven't met one person yet who can't do this. Even people who need to have plenty of time to leave open for reactive work. For example, if your job involves customer service, well, that's fine. You can plan big swaths of time in your day when you are available for that reactive work. But if your job also requires reflective work, meaning you need time to think, it's critical that you book that time as well in your workday.
I mean, there's the maker-manager schedule dichotomy, but everybody has some of each. So it's not like everybody's all one or all the other. There's a classic article on that for those interested in distinguishing between maker schedules and manager schedules. And
so it's the difference between reflective work and reactive work. If you're a maker and you need lots and lots of reflective work, that means you need lots of time when you cannot be interrupted. Whereas managers are more reactive. But even managers, I would argue, they also need time for reflective work. So that critical time to book that hour and a half, time to think is a massive competitive advantage. It's amazing how many people don't appreciate how incredibly productive you can be by just making time to think. Almost nobody does this. And this is a huge competitive advantage these days.
Well, it is really the skill of this economy right now. And increasingly, as artificial intelligence does more routine things, the ability to interpret and process and put a point of view on something is going to be the thing that makes jobs irreplaceable by artificial intelligence, which is something we cover a lot on this show. And the ability to block off and have this deep reflective time, this deep work that Cal Newport talks about, is that superpower you're talking about, that ability to do what you're going to say you're going to do. And part of that is having that time to really go deep and interpret this massive fire hose of information shooting at us. If you're not blocking that time off, if it's not happening, I don't even know how you could compete in this world anymore.
Absolutely. Couldn't say it better myself. That's right.
And one other thing I wanted to just touch on before we wrap up is you had an interesting take on the difference between habits and routines that I hadn't heard before. So I'd love to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. I think, I think habits are a bit oversold.
and it's a very popular topic these days.
It's a very popular topic. And you can see I got all kinds of books on habits. And of course, my first book was about how to build habit-forming products. But I think from a behavior change approach, I think they are a bit misapplied. And what I mean by that is that habits for many people is shorthand for I want something, but I don't really want to have to work hard to do it, right? I want to write that novel, but I want it to become a habit so it's not hard anymore. I want an exercise habit so that it's not difficult to do. It's just something I do automatically, like how easy it is to drive my car. And by definition, a habit is an impulse to do a behavior with little or no conscious thought. The problem is that many behaviors that people want to become habits will never become habits because they're too hard to do. They're not habits, they're routines. So look, I wrote 2 books. It's never easy. It's never something that I do with little or no conscious thought. It's hard work. If you want to write well, you have to think. It's difficult. If you want to get stronger in the gym, if you want to exercise and get better at what you do, you have to push yourself. This is called deliberate practice. And so deliberate practice is not habitual. It's something that requires lots of mental energy, lots of conscious effort. And so those behaviors are not habits. They're routines. Now, you can say, okay, well, whatever, it's just semantics. What's the difference? I think where it really backfires is when someone says, okay, it's New Year's. I've got a New Year's resolution. I'm going to start an exercise habit or a writing habit or whatever. And they start doing this behavior, which will never be a habit. It will only be a routine. And then 30 days in, they say, oh, this isn't easy, right? This is much harder than I thought. And then they think, oh, there must be something wrong with me. Or maybe, and they quit. Whereas I think if the expectations are set that, look, a task, it's okay if a task is difficult, that habits aren't this magic pixie dust that makes anything easy. Some tasks are bad candidates to become habits. So first we have to make a routine out of a behavior, and some of those routines will become habits, but not every behavior that we turn into a routine will necessarily become a habit. Only some behaviors can ever become habits. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two.
I think that's a great point. You see these authors you've written 2 very solid, thoroughly researched books, but they're authors, novelists with dozens and dozens of books who say it never gets easier. In fact, in some ways it gets harder. And that you hear that over and over. And just that kind of prolific effort is never this effortless thing that just pours out of you. You might have moments like that, but not that many. And highlighting that, I think for people diving into new fields that are challenging, to know that going in is helpful. They don't feel like they just aren't cut out for it, but they have to. Everyone has to realize that is what it takes to achieve something in any meaningful, challenging field.
Absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, the personal development, self-help field has told us that, we're supposed to be happy all the time, that we're supposed to be contented. And if we're not happy and satisfied all the time, then something's wrong with us. And nothing could be further from the truth, that feeling bad is not bad. Right? Yeah. It's about getting comfortable with discomfort. That is part of the growth process. That's very important to master, or we will never get better at these difficult tasks.
Yeah, I would even dispute whether happiness should be the goal, but that's a whole other philosophical debate. Where can people, obviously the book, or both of your books, but the most recent one, Indistractable, is a great starting point, and you have a lot of additional material for this on your website. Where can people learn more about that and what you're up to?
Yeah, so my website is niranfar.com. And if you want specifically information about the book, you can go to indestructible.com. And there's an 80-page complimentary workbook there that anyone can download. That's complimentary. You can also, if you do get the book, make sure you keep your order number, no matter where you get the book from. Enter it into my website at indestructible.com, and you can actually get a free video course as well. So that's all available for you at indestructible.com.
Thank you, Nir. This has been fascinating, and we've covered a lot. Really appreciate your sharing all these thoughts.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, leave thoughts or comments below. If you found value in the show, please like the video so it gets promoted in the algorithm. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of the remarkable guest lineup we have in the pipeline. If you're listening to the podcast, ratings and reviews on iTunes or wherever you listen are massively helpful. They help us get promoted on those platforms. Be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to receive show updates, plus my newsletter essay and curated articles on transformational technologies. It comes out every 3 weeks. Everything is accessible at mindandmachine.io. Thanks. Until next time.